A volcano in Indonesia killed 36,000 people, but the real damage was invisible, and it cost empires millions. On August 26, 1883, Krakatoa didn't just explode. It obliterated itself so completely that the sound traveled 3,000 miles. People in Mauritius heard it. In Perth, Australia, ash fell at noon and turned the sky black. But here's the trick: the catastrophe wasn't the eruption itself. It was what happened next, to weather systems, to harvests, to shipping routes, and to the colonial supply chains that held the Victorian economy together. This is the story of how one volcano rewrote global commerce for 5 years straight. Exhibit 1: The immediate property loss. Krakatoa sat in the Sunda Strait between Java and Sumatra, one of the busiest shipping choke points in the world. The eruption triggered a tsunami. Waves 40 feet high wiped out coastal towns. Entire harbor infrastructure vanished. The Dutch colonial government had to quantify the damage, and here's where the ledger gets interesting. They counted dead, yes, but they also counted destroyed warehouses, lost cargo ships, and ruined docking facilities. The material loss in the Sunda Strait alone exceeded 300,000 guilders, an astronomical sum in 1883. But the Dutch weren't the only ones bleeding money. The eruption ejected roughly 5 cubic kilometers of ash and rock into the atmosphere. That dust didn't disappear. It stayed in the stratosphere for years, reflecting sunlight away from Earth. Global temperatures dropped, not catastrophically but measurably. Average temperatures fell between 0, 3 and 2 degrees Celsius depending on the region. That sounds small. It wasn't. Exhibit 2: The global harvest collapse. Cooler temperatures meant shorter growing seasons. In the American Midwest, corn and wheat yields dropped sharply in 1884 and 1885. India faced similar pressure on monsoon-dependent crops. Europe's wine regions saw frost damage to vineyards in spring. These weren't small fluctuations. They were significant enough to push food prices upward across 3 continents. Wheat futures in Chicago spiked. Sugar prices climbed in London. Colonial administrators in India watched grain stores deplete and began rationing. The cash flowed in unexpected directions. Regions that produced food saw windfall profits. Argentina's beef exports surged. Europe needed protein as grain became scarce. Shipping companies that hauled grain from the Americas to Europe saw freight rates climb. Speculation in commodity futures exploded. Traders in London and New York made fortunes betting on price movements they couldn't predict with certainty. Meanwhile, subsistence farmers in Bengal and Ireland faced starvation. The volcano redistributed wealth upward. Exhibit 3: The shipping lane disaster. Remember those destroyed harbors? The rebuilding took years, but that's not the real expense. The eruption and its aftermath made traditional routes unpredictable. Volcanic dust created optical phenomena, red skies, strange sunsets that spooked sailors. More importantly, the temperature changes altered ocean currents and wind patterns. Ships that relied on predictable trade winds found themselves becalmed or blown off course. Insurance premiums for vessels crossing the Indian Ocean climbed 15 to 20%. The British East India Company and Dutch trading firms had to absorb those costs or pass them to customers. Transit times grew unpredictable. A journey that normally took 60 days might stretch to 80. That meant more provisioning costs, more crew wages, more spoilage on perishable goods. Insurance companies, Lloyd's of London among them, had to reassess risk models they used for decades. Some routes became too expensive to maintain. Trade patterns shifted. And here's the trick: nobody could point to a single cause. The disruption looked like normal market volatility, but it was all downstream from one volcano. Exhibit 4: The secondary market panic. News traveled slowly in 1883. Telegrams took hours to cross continents. By the time London knew the full scale of the Krakatoa disaster, markets had already moved. Investors who held colonial bonds backed by trade revenue from the Dutch East Indies began selling. Share prices for shipping companies fell 8 to 12% in some cases. The Bank of England issued guidance to calm depositors. Some smaller regional banks faced runs. The financial system didn't collapse, but it trembled. Colonial governments had to step in. The Dutch East Indies administration borrowed heavily to fund reconstruction. The Indian Famine Commission opened grain stores to prevent mass starvation. These weren't charity expenditures, they were emergency spending, recorded in government ledgers as extraordinary costs. Debt servicing obligations climbed. Tax revenues from trade routes fell because trade itself was disrupted. Several colonial administrations ran deficits for the first time in years. By 1886, the atmospheric dust began to settle. Temperatures recovered, harvests normalized, but the economic scars remained. Insurance premiums didn't drop back to pre-eruption levels immediately, they took years to settle. Trade routes that had shifted didn't always shift back. New shipping companies had emerged to fill gaps. New suppliers in Argentina and Australia had built relationships with European buyers. The map of global commerce didn't return to 1882. Here's what historians often miss. Krakatoa didn't just change the weather. It revealed how fragile the Victorian economy actually was. Empires relied on predictable harvests, predictable shipping times, and predictable insurance calculations. One volcano broke all 3 assumptions simultaneously. The The system held barely, but only because governments and banks had capital reserves to absorb the shock. Smaller economies weren't as lucky. The eruption cost lives. Roughly 36,000 people died in the immediate aftermath. But the economic damage spread across years and continents. Historians can trace food shortages in Ireland, price spikes in London, insurance reform in Amsterdam, and trade restructuring in Hong Kong all back to one day in August 1883. The volcano didn't just reshape weather. It reshaped the networks of money that held the global economy together. When we talk about systemic risk today, we're often discussing financial contagion, how problems in one sector spread to others. Krakatoa was the original case study. A natural disaster became a commodity crisis, which became a shipping crisis, which became a credit crisis. The money didn't disappear, it was redistributed upward, toward traders and speculators who could capitalize on volatility. And the people who bore the real cost were subsistence farmers and colonial laborers who had no leverage in the market at all. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research. If you want to understand how single events reshape entire systems, whether natural disasters, market crashes, or technological shifts, subscribe. There's a new forensic breakdown every week. Subscribe, there's a new forensic breakdown of how money actually moved through history every week. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research.